Biology Digi Workbook 2. This is our new unit, Genetics and Heredity, and we are going to focus on the probability and simple genetics, often called Mendelian genetics. We will move through part of this unit as a video again, and we'll do part of this in class. So we have done the first slide together in class. We're going to have analyzed this in class, but I'm going to record it for you just in case you missed it, or if you want to scrub back through and see what we talked about when you are doing your work. So Unit 7, Heredity and Probability. These little people mean this was a class activity we did together. We flipped coins, we made some observations about each round, and we will talk about probability throughout this unit. So when you flip a coin, just a reminder, because we talked about this today, you have two possible outcomes. It's either heads or it's tails. The probability that it lands heads up is 1 in 2. We can also say that as 1 and 2 for tails up, and we can write it as a fraction 1 out of 2, or 1/2, which also equals 50%. The probability is about what is likely to occur, not what will necessarily or definitely happen. So if we flip a coin 10 times, we might get 5 heads and 5 tails, or we might get 2 heads and 8 tails. One toss has no effect on the next, it's completely random. Also, if I were to give you a homework assignment where you had to flip a coin 100 times and record your responses, I would be able to tell who did it for real and who faked it. So, if you were faking it, you might be tempted to write heads, heads, tails, 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 heads, tails, heads, tails, and it would look roughly about every other. If you did it for real, true randomness, you might end up with 7 or 8 heads in a row, followed by a streak of 10 tails, because it is truly random. There's a 50-50 chance, but that doesn't mean it's going to be heads and then it's going to be tails. Even if you flipped tails 100 times in a row, that has no effect on the next one being heads after all that. So, real randomness is not as predictable, but if we calculated the average, that's what would get us to that 50%. So lesson 1, we talked about this in class and I showed you these pictures, but you might remember that if I remove this, there's a celebrity sibling under here. By looking at this person, do you know who that is off the top of your head? My guess is you did not predict that that is Taylor Swift's brother. They don't look very much alike. So I'll put those back. Now, if I remove this rectangle, who do you think that is? Looks familiar, right? That's because my sister and I look a lot more alike than Taylor Swift and her brother do. So why is that? Go ahead and write in your slides, why do some siblings look a lot alike and some look nothing alike? You might even feel like you and your sibling don't even look related, let alone like you could possibly be twins. So there's a person who studied heredity. His name was Gregor Mendel. So Mendel, you can see from his lovely outfit here, he was an Austrian monk in the mid-1800s, but before that he was actually a biologist. So often he just gets billed as this monk who was incredibly observant and noticed that his plants were growing in patterns, and he was able to calculate the percentage of certain colors of his flowers on his plants. But he had training as a biologist before that, so it's not quite true to believe that he was just this brilliant monk. But he also, if you're a monk in 1850, do you think you have your iPhone? Can you watch TikToks? Can you watch Netflix? Any of that? Probably not. So he didn't have all that much to do besides watching the plants grow. In fact, if anyone's going to come up with a new theory on science, now is probably the time when you're not really doing much but watching the plants grow. So maybe you're going to be the next Mendel. We don't know. Anyway, he noticed that some pea plants, the peas like you eat green peas in a pod, some grew tall, some were short, some made yellow peas, some made green peas, and others had yellow peas. And Mendel observed that the forms of the pea plants were often similar to their parents, but sometimes they were different even if they came directly from the generation before. And he called this heredity, the passing of physical characteristics from parents to offspring. So you can think of the word inheritance. You inherited your traits from your parents before you.
These days, scientists know how you inherit characteristics from your parents. They're able to calculate probabilities of having a specific trait or getting a genetic disease according to the information they have from the parents and the family history. But how is this possible? To understand how traits pass from one living being to its descendants, we need to go back in time to the 19th century and a man named Gregor Mendel. Mendel was an Austrian monk and biologist who loved to work with plants. By breeding the pea plants he was growing in the monastery's garden, he discovered the principles that rule heredity. In one of the most classic examples, Mendel combined a purebred yellow-seeded plant with a purebred green-seeded plant, and he got only yellow seeds. He called the yellow color trait the dominant one, because it was expressed in all the new seeds. Then he let the new yellow-seeded hybrid plants self-fertilize, and in this second generation he got both yellow and green seeds, which meant that the green trait had been hidden by the dominant yellow. He called this hidden trait the recessive trait. From those results, Mendel inferred that each trait depends on a pair of factors, one of them coming from the mother and the other from the father. Now we know that these factors are called alleles and represent the different variations of a gene. Depending on which type of allele Mendel found in each seed, we can have what we call a homozygous pea, where both alleles are identical, and what we call a heterozygous pea, when the two alleles are different. This combination of alleles is known as genotype, and its result, being yellow or green, is called phenotype. To clearly visualize how alleles are distributed amongst descendants, we can use a diagram called the Punnett square. You just place the different alleles on both axes, and then you figure out the possible combinations. Let's look at Mendel's peas, for example. Let's write the dominant yellow allele as an uppercase Y, and the recessive green allele as a lowercase y. The uppercase y always overpowers its lowercase friend, so the only time you get green babies is if you have two lowercase y's. In Mendel's first generation, the yellow homozygous pea mom will give each pea kid a yellow dominant allele, and the green homozygous pea dad will give a green recessive allele, so all the pea kids will be yellow heterozygous. Then, in the second generation, where the two heterozygous kids marry, their babies could have any of the three possible genotypes, showing the two possible phenotypes in a 3-to-1 proportion. But even peas have a lot of characteristics. For example, besides being yellow or green, peas may be round or wrinkled. So we could have all these possible combinations: round yellow peas, round green peas, wrinkled yellow peas, and wrinkled green peas. To calculate the proportions for each genotype and phenotype, we can use a Punnett square too. Of course, this will make it a little more complex. And lots of things are more complicated than peas, like, say, people. These days, scientists know a lot more about genetics and heredity, and there are many other ways in which some characteristics are inherited, but it all started with Mendel and his peas.
Okay. If you want to watch that video again, those are in your slides. Just click on the word heredity and it brings you back to that YouTube. I know that was a lot of vocabulary, but we're going to break it down a little bit more. So, one more thing you need to know, cross-pollination. Just like bees pollinate flowers, that means plants breeding together. So we talked about asexual and sexual reproduction last unit. Asexual reproduction, all the plants are identical clones or bacteria or sponges, simple animals. But there are many plants, especially flowering plants, that actually reproduce sexually, meaning there's a sperm and an egg cell. That's actually what bees help with. So when bees transfer the pollen from one flower to the next, they're actually helping with fertilization, and that's why gardens are healthier when bees have access to them. So in this diagram, P stands for parent. So that's the parent generation. And when they say true breeding parents, they mean Mendel crossed ones that he knew were truly purple flowers and ones that he knew were truly white flowers. They didn't have any secret hidden genetics, which we'll talk about soon. So he took a purple flowering plant, meaning the flower of the pea plant was purple, and he crossed it with a white flowering plant. So he took the pollen from one of these and the pollen from one of those, mixed it together, and then made new plants. F1 stands for filial one. Filial, if you remember maybe from history class, filial piety means family-oriented or son or daughter. So F1 generation, these were hybrids between these two, and he noticed that all of those plants ended up having purple flowers, even if they had pollen from the white flower. So we'll talk about why that happened. Then, self-fertilization means he used the pollen from this flower to fertilize it or other ones within the same generation, so that he knew the genetics were all coming from this F1 generation and it came out with something different. So here we have the next. So he crossed those purple plants from this generation with each other, with themselves, the same generation, cross-pollination there. And then he found out that 3 out of every 4 plants that he made, so if he had 100 plants, 75 of those 100, roughly 75%, ended up purple. but 25 came out white even when their parents were all purple flowers. So go ahead and write down here, how is self-pollination different from asexual reproduction? And if you're not sure, I did explain it on the slide before that looked like this. So go back one slide and listen to my explanation and write your answer. Pause now if you need more time. Here is an overview of Mendel's 3 steps once again. So he took the true breeding, meaning he knew they were only purple flower genetics from these flowers. He knew these were only white flower genetics. He crossed them with themselves just to make sure that he only got purples and he only got whites. So that's how he was kind of using his control there. Then he crossed those together and they all came out purple. Then when he crossed these from this crop of flowers, this generation that were all purple, he ended up with the 3/4 purple and 1/4 white. And if you look at this statistic down here, we can do a little bit of math. So I'm going to add a text box. You can add this to your slide or you can just watch on mine. But 705 plus 224 equals 929, right? So total flowers out of this 705 plus 224 is 929 flowers. So that's his total number of flowers. Then we can calculate out of 929 total flowers, we can figure out what percentage were purple and what percentage were white. So this is 705 out of that 929, and you won't have to do this on your own. I just want to show you how this math works out. So 705 divided by 929, I'm going to do it on my calculator right now, not in my head, don't worry. Okay, that comes out to 76% if I round up. Then, if we do the rest, so I want to know the white flowers now. There were 224 white flowers over here out of the 929 total. You can probably do this in your head, but we'll do it out just so that we can see what Mendel had to do. That comes out to 24%, which is perfect. Those add up to 100. So if we look at the 224 white flowers, that ends up being 25% of the total number of flowers. That's what that 729 was. This is about 1/4, and that was about 3/4. So his math works out. Now, do you think biology is going to end up with perfect numbers every time? Probably not. But he was able to plant enough flowers that he had a really good sample size, meaning his scientific method, he was able to follow it. He had enough data for it to make sense. And he found that most of the time, he had roughly 3/4 of one color and then 1/4 of the other. And we'll talk about what he discovered from that. So go ahead, try these questions. I'll read them to you, but I'd like you to try them on your own. We'll go over them together in class. Here's your word bank. So when two plants with different traits are crossed together, it's called a blank. You can type your answer here. Number 2, a blank is a group of offspring from a given group of parents. Number 3, a physical feature that is inherited is called a character, which has a star. I define why there's a star on the next page. And 4, each specific characteristic, stem height, seed color, etc., is called a blank. There is an extra word there that you will not need. So figure out which one you don't need. So character versus trait. I've given you this table so that you can compare the difference. So if you see up here, we have the character is seeds, and then within that you have round or wrinkled, yellow or green, just like in the video. The flower color is a character, but the options down below, the trait choices, are white or violet red, that's purple. The character for the pod shape, meaning the outside where the peas are inside, you can either have full or constricted, meaning you can see that the peas, you can see them from the outside, or it's yellow versus green. Or for the stem, meaning the part where the flowers are growing on the plant, axial means it's growing around the side of the plant, and then terminal means the flowers only come up at the very top of the plant. And then they can be long or short or tall plants versus short plants. So the character is kind of like the overall category, and then the trait are the specific choices within each category. Go ahead and put the difference in your own words between a character and a trait down here. Take some time, hit pause if you're not ready to go to the next one. So I left that for you there. What are some examples of characters? Remember, these are our characters and some examples of traits down here in peas. Write that down here. And then here's the chart for peas, but you know what humans look like, I hope. So what are some examples of characters here versus traits in humans? If you're not sure about the difference between character or trait, use this as your example. These are all the characters. All of these down below are the traits. So Mendelian theory or Mendelian heredity, remember Mendel, the monk and gardener and biologist who figured out these patterns, explains simple patterns of inheritance, meaning it's either one trait or the other. There are only two options. So it's either a purple flower or it's a white flower. Either the peas inside are yellow or they're green. Not quite like humans. We have lots of choices. Even for eye color, you could have dark brown eyes, light brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, hazel eyes, some sort of combination in there, one of each. So humans are far more complicated than peas, but this helps him figure out some of these basic characteristics, and so they call them simple patterns of inheritance as opposed to the more complex ones in humans. All right, we have a few more vocab words today. So we have alleles. So genes are the factors that control each trait. So the gene gives you your eye color or your height or even your personality in some cases, or your disdain for Brussels sprouts. That's a gene. A gene's part of your DNA. Each version of the gene that you could have, so let's say blue eyes versus brown eyes, that is called an allele. Each individual, meaning you, has two alleles for a given character. So if the character is eye color, you either have an allele for brown or you have an allele for green. Or you might have two of the same ones. You might have two alleles for brown eyes, depending on what your parents gave you. We'll get into that more tomorrow. A single gamete, you remember what a gamete is, sperm or egg, only carries one of each of those alleles. So one sperm might carry the blue-eyed allele and the egg might carry the brown-eyed allele. So how do we get from a single allele per gamete to the pairs of alleles found in humans? Go ahead and think that through. So how did we get from one in each back to two together? What do we call that concept? You just took a quiz on this. And this is what I always think of when I hear the word allele. It's going to bring you to a super important YouTube link. You ready? Here we go. That was really necessary, I know. I'm glad we took a break to do that. Okay. So, the gene that controls flower color in the pea plants that Mendel studied has two alleles, meaning two possible choices. One allele for purple flowers and one for white flowers. One allele comes from the egg and one comes from the sperm, so each offspring has an allele from each parent. And you and pea plants, for example, end up being a mashup of both of your biological parents. You have some genetic material from both parents. Some of it's expressed, some of it's hidden, and we're going to talk about that soon. So what are the three possible flower color allele pairs? So the flowers only come in two colors, purple or white, but what are the possible combinations of the genes that they got from their parents if our choices are purple or white? So we can have purple and purple. We can have, go ahead and fill this in, white and white, meaning two flower parents that have white flowers. Or go ahead and fill in the third one on your own, and we'll talk about it tomorrow. So what is the third possible combination if you know that only purple and white are the choices? An organism's traits are controlled by the alleles that it inherits from its parents. So those purple versus white if you're a pea plant flower, over here in this example, round versus wrinkled, or if we're talking about human eye color, blue versus green versus brown versus hazel. So a dominant allele is one whose trait will always show up in the organism if that allele is present. It's kind of like the loud one. The opposite is called a recessive allele, and it's hidden when a dominant allele is present. It's shy. So for example, here in this picture, a dominant seed shape of peas is round. A recessive pea shape is wrinkled. So if you breed a dominant with a recessive, it's going to have a hidden gene for that wrinkled pea, and it's going to end up looking round. So dominant times recessive is going to equal looks dominant, but it has a hidden secret gene for the recessive, and we'll talk about how we write that in a moment. So if a dominant and recessive are bred together, the offspring will always be round. They're always going to look like the dominant one. So I like to think of this as think about your loudest friend and your quietest friend. If your loud friend comes into the room, you always know they're there. They make it really obvious that they have entered, and you hear them and you can't miss them. Sometimes when your quiet friend comes in the room, if they're the only one in there, you notice them. But if they're not the only one in there, if the loud one's in there, you might not even notice that your quiet friend has come in. So that's how I like to think of dominant versus recessive. If dominant's there, you can't miss it, we'll always see it. If recessive is there, we might not see it if it's hidden by the dominant gene. But if it's there by itself, or if, for example, there are two of the same recessive allele there, we will see that one because there is no loud one overpowering it. So with these peas in this diagram, which trait will be expressed in a double dominant? So if you have, go ahead and circle one of these. If you breed together two round peas and that's the dominant trait, is that going to be dominant looking, or is it going to look recessive, wrinkled? If you breed two recessives together, two wrinkled peas, is it going to look dominant, be smooth, round, or is it going to look recessive if you breed two wrinkled peas that are recessive together? Now, my original example, if you breed this round pea with this wrinkled pea, is it going to look dominant or is it going to look recessive? If we have the loud friend with the quiet friend, who are we going to hear? Go ahead and answer by circling or underlining one of those choices. If you're confused about this, we're going to work through this together in class tomorrow, so it'll be a little bit less confusing. Let's practice one more time. So, which traits based on this chart are dominant and which are recessive? So here are the parents. We have purple parent and white parent yields F1, meaning the offspring generation. So purple and a white flower are going to make a purple flower. That means the purple one is dominant because that white gene kind of got lost when we bred it with the purple one. So the purple was the loud, the white was the shy, and then we ended up with a purple offspring that has a hidden white gene. Now that one seems more obvious because purple's a darker color, but it might not necessarily be the case. So if white, for example, were dominant, we would see the white flower down there, even if we mixed it with a darker color flower. If that was confusing, you can ignore my previous statement. So go ahead and based on this chart, so here are what the parents are breeding together. Here's what their offspring look like, that filial one, that F1 generation. List 4 dominant traits from here and 4 recessive traits. So you're thinking this through, you're writing it in your slide, type in which traits. So I'll start with an example because we just did this one, but purple is the dominant trait. So you could list white flower, purple flower there. If you want to list white flower there, that's fine. If you want to use 4 unique ones in each side, that's fine too. Take some time and do that. Pause me. We'll go over these together in class. Okay, 2 more slides today. So we saw this in the video, and in fact, I grabbed this from the video. A heterozygous is a fancy word for a genetic hybrid. So think about the prefix hetero. That means mixed. So a heterotroph needs a mixed food source. They can't make it in their own bodies. We had homozygous is a new word coming up. Sorry, spoiler alert. We had homologous chromosomes. That prefix homo meant same. So the homologous chromosomes were the same chromosome in the egg within the zygote that you learned about last unit. So a heterozygous is a fancy word for a genetic hybrid, meaning one dominant, one recessive. It's an organism that has 2 different alleles for the same trait. A, quote, pure dominant would be capital Y, is bred with a recessive, which would be little y, to make that heterozygous, capital Y, little y. So here you can see in the picture, dominant is a yellow pea. These are our pea plants again. Recessive is green. When we breed them together, even though that green color is darker, that green trait gets hidden and overpowered by the yellow, and then the child, the baby, the offspring, ends up having 1 yellow gene, 1 green gene, which we write as little y, just so we know we're talking about the same allele pair, but it ends up looking like the dominant parent, okay? So, blending hypothesis suggests that a tall pea plant and a short pea plant would make a medium pea plant, like mixing paint. Based on what we've learned about white and purple flowers, yellow and green peas, dominant and recessive, loud and quiet friends, is this true? Why or why not? Go ahead, write that there, and we'll talk about that in class tomorrow. Okay, here's our same diagram before. We have our round pea or wrinkled pea, parent generations, and then the offspring is 1. So here's how we abbreviate those alleles. For example, if we're using a T for plant height, tall, capital T, or not tall, we use the same letter over and over so that we know we're talking about the same allele pair. So T for tall, we use capital letters, and you can remember that this is the loud one, which is why we use the capital letters. Recessive, we write it in lowercase. This is the shy one. So we use a little t for not tall or short in the case of pea plants. So for this one, round versus wrinkled, we might use R's. So we'll go ahead and write out what you think a pure round pea is. Is it going to be capital R, lowercase r, or lowercase r? So round is dominant, wrinkled is recessive, capital is for dominant, lowercase is for recessive. Go ahead and write out what you think a wrinkled pea would be. And then write out what a heterozygous, remember from here, if you go back to the slide before, here's our little heterozygous pea buddy. We have a capital lowercase, spoiler. Go ahead, write out the hybrid pea abbreviation. Now, one more question based on that hybrid pea. Would that hybrid pea based on this look rounded or wrinkled? And why? So go ahead and write that down here. Okay, you've reached the end of lesson 1. We are going to continue and do the next slide together in class. So go ahead and stop here. There's no more video. Good job. Finish up your questions. You don't have to submit or turn in because we're going to keep working on this workbook. But if you finished writing your questions, you're finished. If you need to go back, make sure you finish those questions so that if we check your work and grade it, you're not missing anything. Thank you.